On a sweltering July morning in 1942, the vast Russian steppes shimmered under the summer sun as German panzers and infantry columns moved relentlessly southward. From afar, the jagged peaks of the Caucasus Mountains rose like a distant fortress, their snow-capped summits glinting against the horizon. To many of the advancing soldiers, these mountains seemed an abstract, unreachable line of rock and ice, a mere obstacle in their path. Yet for the architects of Nazi Germany's war strategy in Berlin, these peaks represented much more. They were the gateway to the oil-rich heartland of the Soviet Union, a prize that could fuel their war machine for years, and perhaps, a turning point in the conflict on the Eastern Front. By mid-1942, the German war effort was increasingly strained by one critical limitation: oil. The blitzkrieg strategies that had carried German armies to stunning victories across Europe depended on fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support, all of which consumed vast amounts of fuel. Synthetic oil production in Germany was insufficient to meet these demands, and imports from abroad were increasingly disrupted by Allied blockades. Meanwhile, intelligence reports indicated that the Soviet Union's southern territories, particularly the Caucasus region stretching from the Kuban Plains to the Caspian Sea, contained vast oil fields, the likes of which could supply the German military for months, if not years. The oil fields of Baku, Grozny, and Mako were renowned not only for their volume but for their strategic importance. Controlling them could determine the outcome of the war itself. The stakes were unmistakable. Hitler and the German High Command viewed capturing the Caucasus not as a routine military objective but as a strategic necessity. Without access to the region's resources, the German war economy risked slowing to a dangerous crawl. Securing the oil fields promised to refuel tanks and aircraft, maintain industrial output, and ensure that Germany could continue to project force on multiple fronts. Conversely, denying the Soviets these resources could cripple their war effort and perhaps shorten the Eastern Front campaign significantly. The decision to launch a southern offensive was as much about economics as it was about territory. It was a gamble of ambition, resource necessity, and timing. This strategy took shape under what would later be called Operation Blue, Fall Blau, the German summer offensive of 1942. The operation was carefully planned, designed to strike deep into Soviet territory, secure key economic centers, and split the Red Army forces in the south. By July, Hitler divided Army Group South into two distinct forces, one to advance on Stalingrad along the Volga River, thereby controlling vital transport routes and further dividing Soviet forces. The other, called Army Group A, was tasked with advancing into the Caucasus to seize the oil-rich territories and strategic passes leading into the mountains. This southern thrust was later dubbed Operation Edelweiss, an ambitious plan that aimed to conquer the mountains, secure oil fields, and create a springboard for further operations in the Middle East. The logistical challenges of such a campaign were enormous. From the starting positions near Rostov-on-Don, German forces had to traverse hundreds of kilometers of open steppe before even reaching the foothills of the Caucasus. The terrain would change drastically from flat, open plains favorable for mechanized maneuvers to rugged, unpredictable mountains that would hinder tanks, slow supply convoys, and exhaust soldiers. The further into the Caucasus they advanced, the more stretched the supply lines became, leaving forward units vulnerable to counterattack and resource shortages. Many German generals privately expressed concerns that the plan was overambitious and that the army risked becoming bogged down in terrain that was ideal for defenders rather than attackers. Yet Hitler insisted that speed and audacity would win the day, viewing hesitation as a greater risk than overextension. The Soviet Union, however, was not unprepared. Soviet strategists understood the immense value of the Caucasus region. It was the industrial and resource backbone of the southern USSR. Losing the oil fields could starve not only the Red Army but the civilian economy, affecting transport, food distribution, and military production. Soviet commanders strengthened defenses along key approaches to the mountains, fortified cities like Grozny and Mako, and prepared to implement scorched earth tactics to deny oil to the Germans. Retreating forces were ordered to destroy wells, pipelines, and equipment that might otherwise fall into enemy hands. The stage was set for a clash not only of armies but of strategy, geography, and willpower. On July 23, 1942, Army Group A commenced its advance into the Caucasus. German columns, spearheaded by armored divisions, moved swiftly across the Kuban plains, capturing small towns and logistical hubs along the way. Rostov-on-Don fell within days, opening the gateway to the Caucasus foothills. The speed of the initial advance stunned the Soviets, forcing them to hastily withdraw deeper into the mountain passes, where they would make their stand. The German forces also included specialized mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, trained to navigate steep inclines and treacherous terrain. These units would be critical in pushing through the rugged passes and attempting to reach the oilfields beyond, a task that conventional infantry and tanks could not accomplish. Amid the military maneuvering, the campaign also held symbolic significance. On August 21, 1942, a detachment of German mountain troops scaled Mount Elbrus, Europe's highest peak, and planted the Nazi flag on its summit. This act was intended to demonstrate German reach and dominance, a psychological and propagandistic victory designed to bolster morale at home and intimidate enemies. Yet, while visually striking, the flag on the mountain would ultimately prove hollow. Controlling a peak did not equate to controlling the vital oil infrastructure, nor did it guarantee logistical sustainability in a region where nature itself challenged every step of the invading force. The initial weeks of the campaign revealed both the promise and the peril of Germany's strategy. The open plains allowed rapid movement and early territorial gains, but as the forces neared the foothills, the terrain slowed their progress, complicated supply lines, and exposed them to guerrilla-style attacks by Soviet units familiar with the mountains. Every advance into the Caucasus highlighted the immense difficulty of sustaining an army hundreds of kilometers from supply depots, in an environment where roads were scarce and weather unpredictable. The German army had underestimated the challenge posed not by the Soviet soldiers alone, but by the combination of geography, climate, and the necessity of maintaining long supply lines across a hostile landscape. By the end of July and into August, the campaign had achieved its first visible victories, towns captured, passes secured, and the approach to oilfields within sight. Yet, despite these gains, a deeper reality was becoming clear. Taking control of the Caucasus would be far more difficult than simply occupying land. The oilfields were heavily sabotaged by retreating Soviet forces, the terrain demanded specialized warfare, and the wider Eastern Front demanded German attention elsewhere, particularly at Stalingrad, where Soviet resistance threatened to bog down one of Germany's other major offensives. The gamble that Hitler and his generals had undertaken was now fully underway, and the outcome, whether triumph or disaster, remained uncertain. As August turned toward September, the battle for the Caucasus would test every aspect of Germany's military capability, logistical planning, tactical innovation, endurance, and leadership. The initial victories, while impressive, foreshadowed the real challenge, conquering not merely towns or mountains, but an entire region whose defenses, geography, and climate would conspire to challenge any invader. The Caucasus campaign had begun as a bold, audacious gamble, and the following months would reveal whether Germany's ambition could withstand the relentless forces of terrain, resistance, and the unforgiving demands of war. Into the mountains, triumphs, trials, and the edge of the Caucasus. As the German columns pressed southward from Rostov-on-Don, the landscape began to change dramatically. The endless flatlands of southern Russia gave way to rolling hills, dense forests, and finally the rugged, snow-draped slopes of the Caucasus. For the soldiers on the ground, the early days of the campaign had felt like a swift march across open terrain, a rhythm of engines, marching boots, and the occasional skirmish. Now, with every kilometer, the mountains imposed themselves as an almost tangible adversary, shaping strategy, slowing movement, and demanding ingenuity in ways the plains never had. The advance had entered a new and treacherous phase. By early August 1942, Army Group A had achieved its initial objectives. Rostov-on-Don had fallen swiftly, Mako, a key oil center, had been captured, and German units had secured the northern approaches to the Kuban region. Yet behind these victories lay enormous challenges. The flatlands had allowed tanks and mechanized infantry to operate at peak efficiency, but the foothills and eventual mountain passes rendered many of these advantages moot. Roads grew narrow, steep, and winding, rivers required precarious crossings, and the weather, hot by day and bitterly cold by night, began to sap both men and machinery. Commanders recognized that the pace of operations would slow dramatically, and that German logistical networks, already stretched thin, would be tested to their limits. Despite these difficulties, German planners pressed forward, convinced that rapid, decisive action was necessary. The deployment of specialized mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger divisions, proved essential. These elite units were trained for climbing, skiing, and fighting in high-altitude terrain, able to traverse passes that conventional infantry and armored divisions could not. Their presence signaled the seriousness of the operation. Germany intended not merely to occupy the plains and northern foothills, but to strike deep into the heart of the Caucasus, capture strategic passes, and ultimately seize the oilfields of Grozny and Baku. The mountains were no longer a distant horizon, they were the battlefield itself. The Soviets, for their part, had anticipated the German advance into these difficult regions. As German forces approached, Soviet troops executed delaying tactics, fortified villages, and prepared mountain ambushes. Bridges were destroyed, roads mined, and rearguard actions implemented to slow the Wehrmacht's momentum. Even as German units moved through towns like Tvis and along river valleys, they faced snipers, partisan attacks, and artillery fire that exploited the natural defensive advantages of the terrain. Every victory came at a cost: time, resources, and energy, and the Germans began to realize that seizing territory in the Caucasus would be far more arduous than capturing a town on the plains. In parallel with ground operations, the campaign had a symbolic dimension that attracted both military and public attention. On August 21, a small detachment of German Gebirgsjäger ascended Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in the Caucasus and all of Europe. Raising the Nazi flag on the summit was intended to demonstrate German audacity and dominance, an emblematic victory that could be broadcast across Europe. Yet even this dramatic feat was largely ceremonial. The peak's symbolic conquest did little to address the practical realities of capturing the oil fields hidden beyond the mountains. Logistics, terrain, and local resistance remain the true obstacles to strategic success. Throughout August and September 1942, the German advance saw a mix of rapid gains and grueling halts. Armored divisions often outpaced infantry, creating gaps that needed bridging, while the mountainous terrain slowed convoys and complicated supply delivery. Roads were often narrow, winding, and prone to collapse under heavy loads. Every vehicle, from light trucks to panzer tanks, struggled on steep inclines, and fuel shortages became a constant concern. Units that had raced across the plains were now forced into methodical, exhausting progress over heights and ridges that gave defenders a distinct advantage. Maps became vital, reconnaissance dangerous, and every pass a potential trap. By mid-September, German units had reached Mozdok, one of the northern gateways to the main Caucasus passes. Here, the mountain's full challenge became apparent. From Mozdok, multiple routes, the Maruksky Pass, the Klukhorsky Pass, and the Tverda Valley, offered potential paths into the deeper Caucasus. Each path, however, was heavily defended or easily sabotaged. Soviet forces had fortified choke points, set up artillery emplacements, and prepared ambushes in narrow valleys where tanks were less effective. The battle had evolved from a war of movement to a war of attrition, where knowledge of the terrain and local support could tip the balance. German forces, despite superior training and technology, were being forced into protracted engagements, and their speed advantage from the plains was disappearing. Complicating matters, the Germans faced a logistic paradox: the farther they pushed into the mountains, the less support they could provide. Supply convoys were delayed by destroyed roads, destroyed bridges, and enemy action. Fuel, ammunition, and food became precious commodities. Even fresh reinforcements struggled to reach forward positions without encountering bottlenecks or natural obstacles. Engineers worked frantically to repair roads, construct bridges, and clear minefields, but the scale of the challenge was enormous. Every kilometer gained required disproportionate effort, and the initial optimism of a lightning advance began to wane under the relentless pressure of terrain and attrition. Simultaneously, the strategic situation beyond the Caucasus began to influence operations. The German offensive towards Stalingrad on the Volga demanded attention, and resources including aircraft, artillery, and reinforcements were being diverted to support the Stalingrad front. This dual pressure forced German commanders to balance ambition in the Caucasus with operational reality, a tension that would increasingly shape the campaign. Army Group A could advance only so far without jeopardizing other fronts, and every decision was fraught with risk. By late September, the Germans had managed to secure several mountain towns and passes, but the campaign was approaching its most critical phase. The oilfields of Grozny and the approaches to Baku were tantalizingly close in distance but daunting in difficulty. Terrain, climate, and Soviet fortifications meant that even after months of advance, the Wehrmacht had not yet secured the strategic objectives that had motivated the entire operation. The initial momentum of the campaign had slowed to a grinding advance, and the soldiers who had once raced across the plains now found themselves facing harsh winds, snow-covered slopes, and relentless enemy resistance. In addition to physical challenges, morale and psychology played a role. Soldiers faced isolation, supply shortages, and the awareness that, despite early victories, the real prizes remained out of reach. Officers tried to maintain discipline and forward momentum, emphasizing the importance of capturing oil and securing the Caucasus as vital to Germany's survival. Yet the difficulty of the terrain, combined with relentless Soviet opposition, created an environment where even small setbacks could feel catastrophic. Every destroyed bridge, ambushed convoy, or mined pass became a reminder of the high stakes and the unforgiving nature of mountain warfare. The early successes of Army Group A, while noteworthy, underscored a fundamental truth: in the Caucasus, the natural landscape was as much an enemy as the Soviet forces. Every advance required careful planning, resource management, and adaptation to the environment. The mountains themselves dictated the rhythm of the campaign, slowing even the most experienced units and testing the limits of German operational capacity. By the end of September, it was clear that the Caucasus would not be conquered by speed alone. The campaign demanded endurance, ingenuity, and extraordinary perseverance. As October approached, the Germans faced a sobering reality: capturing towns and passes was not equivalent to securing functional control over the oilfields and resources that had driven the campaign. Despite territorial gains and symbolic victories, the logistical and strategic difficulties of the Caucasus meant that the Wehrmacht's ambitions were being tested in ways that could not have been fully predicted. The mountains, rivers, and narrow passes had transformed a rapid southern offensive into a complex and demanding operation, one in which the margin for error was narrow and the consequences of failure would be severe. The Caucasus Campaign, initially envisioned as a swift strike to seize oil and strategic advantage, had now entered a phase defined by hard-fought progress, grueling terrain, and mounting logistical challenges. For both the Germans and the Soviets, the coming months would prove decisive. The German army would need to overcome the natural and man-made obstacles of the mountains, while the Soviets would attempt to hold their vital southern resources at all costs. The gamble was no longer theoretical, it was an immediate, physical, and exhausting reality, unfolding on some of the most formidable terrain in Europe. Strain and resistance, the turning tide in the Caucasus. By October 1942, the initial optimism of the German southern offensive had begun to clash sharply with reality. Army Group A, once a swiftly advancing force on the open plains, now found itself entangled in the rugged, snow-swept landscapes of the Caucasus. For months, soldiers had endured relentless marches, unpredictable weather, and supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers. What had been envisioned as a rapid thrust toward the oilfields of Grozny and Baku had transformed into a grinding struggle against not only the terrain but an enemy determined to defend every valley and pass. The mountains imposed a relentless toll on logistics. Every kilometer gained required painstaking effort. Engineers rebuilt roads destroyed by retreating Soviet forces, bridges were reconstructed under fire, and pack animals were pressed into service to transport ammunition, food, and medical supplies where vehicles could not pass. Fuel shortages became a constant concern. Tanks and trucks, once the pride of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, now struggled over icy slopes and precarious switchbacks. The farther the army pushed, the thinner its lines became, leaving forward units isolated and vulnerable to Soviet attacks from unexpected directions. The Soviet defenders, keenly aware of these vulnerabilities, mounted a determined and adaptive resistance. Partisan fighters harassed supply routes, ambushed convoys, and sabotaged critical infrastructure. Regular Red Army units, reinforced by local militias, utilized the mountains' natural advantages to stage defensive operations. Narrow passes became death traps for advancing German columns, steep ridges allowed Soviet artillery to dominate valleys below, and fortified villages offered strongpoints that resisted repeated assaults. Every advance required careful reconnaissance, coordination, and costly frontal engagements. German generals began to recognize that the mountains themselves were as formidable an opponent as the Red Army. Despite these challenges, Army Group A pressed forward, driven by the strategic imperative to secure oil before winter set in. By mid-October, German units had captured the town of Nalchik, a key gateway into the Central Caucasus. The victory, however, came at a significant cost. Casualties mounted, vehicles were destroyed or immobilized, and the supply situation grew increasingly precarious. Commanders struggled to maintain morale among troops exhausted by months of relentless operations, while the weather began to turn sharply colder, bringing snow to passes and freezing rivers that complicated movement and reduced operational tempo. As German forces advanced deeper into the mountains, the limitations of their strategic planning became increasingly apparent. The initial assumptions that the Wehrmacht could move quickly, outflank Soviet defenses, and seize the oilfields with minimal delay were proving overly optimistic. The complexity of mountain warfare, combined with the vast distances from supply bases, forced a re-evaluation of priorities. Some units were diverted to secure flanks and protect stretched supply lines, while others were forced to halt or consolidate positions, reducing the overall momentum of the campaign. The dream of a swift conquest of the Caucasus was now giving way to the sobering reality of attrition and endurance. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not merely defending passively, they were preparing to strike back. Reinforcements were funneled into key defensive positions, and counteroffensives were launched in areas where German overreach had created vulnerabilities. In the Tverda and Klukhorsky passes, for instance, Soviet troops conducted targeted attacks on isolated German detachments, exploiting gaps in coordination and the difficulty of supplying forward units. These engagements were often small in scale but psychologically significant, demonstrating that even well-trained German forces were not invincible in the harsh Caucasus terrain. The campaign's logistics continued to dominate operational planning. Roads carved into steep cliffs, precarious bridges over swift mountain rivers, and the constant threat of winter snowstorms meant that moving even modest amounts of supplies required immense effort. Pack animals and improvised cable systems were employed to transport fuel, artillery shells, and food. Every shipment was critical, any delay or disruption could leave forward units exposed and immobile. Commanders faced the grim calculus of balancing speed, firepower, and sustainability, a challenge made even more acute by the dual demands of the Stalingrad front to the north, which diverted resources and attention away from the southern offensive. By late October, German forces had reached the outskirts of the oil-rich city of Grozny. Yet capturing the city and securing its infrastructure proved far more difficult than anticipated. Soviet engineers had implemented extensive demolition plans, destroying wells, pipelines, and refining facilities to deny the Wehrmacht immediate access to oil. Urban combat, combined with continued mountain engagements, stretched German forces thin and exposed them to repeated counterattacks. Each step forward required careful coordination, often under enemy fire, and the cost in casualties and resources was mounting rapidly. The promise of abundant oilfields remained tantalizingly close but frustratingly out of reach. In addition to logistical and tactical challenges, German forces faced the psychological strain of sustained combat in a harsh environment. Soldiers confronted freezing nights, insufficient food, and the constant threat of ambushes. Mountain warfare demanded relentless physical exertion, and morale was tested as the initial speed and momentum of the offensive evaporated. Leaders emphasized discipline and the strategic importance of their mission, yet fatigue and the awareness of growing Soviet resistance created an environment where small mistakes could have disastrous consequences. The turning tide in the Caucasus also highlighted a broader strategic dilemma for Germany. The simultaneous focus on Stalingrad to the north and the Caucasus to the south stretched command and control capabilities. Decisions that might have been manageable on a single front became exponentially more complex when applied to multiple, geographically separated theaters. Coordination between Army Groups A and B, along with the allocation of reinforcements, artillery, and air support, became a logistical and operational nightmare. The campaign was no longer simply about seizing territory, it was about sustaining forces in one of the most challenging environments in Europe while maintaining pressure elsewhere. By the end of October, the situation crystallized into a stark reality. The Caucasus campaign was no longer a rapid dash to victory but a protracted struggle marked by attrition, hardship, and uncertainty. German forces had achieved territorial gains and symbolic victories, yet the strategic objectives, control of the oilfields and secure mountain passes, remained incomplete. The initial gamble of rapid conquest had evolved into a test of endurance, adaptability, and leadership. The mountains had imposed their will on both men and machines, and the Wehrmacht's ability to continue pressing forward would determine the ultimate outcome of the southern offensive. The lessons of the campaign were becoming clear. Success in the Caucasus required more than numerical superiority or mechanized power, it demanded respect for terrain, attention to logistics, and the capacity to endure psychological and physical strain. The Soviets, leveraging local knowledge, fortifications, and strategic patience, were demonstrating that even in retreat, they could impose severe costs and complicate German plans. The battle for the Caucasus had reached a critical phase, one in which the combination of environmental challenges, logistical constraints, and determined resistance could decisively influence the fate of the campaign. As November approached, German troops huddled in mountain encampments, aware that winter was approaching and that the final phase of their ambitious southern offensive was imminent. The rugged landscape, fierce defenders, and overstretched resources combined to create a situation in which every decision mattered. The campaign had evolved from a bold, fast-paced offensive into a grinding, high-stakes test of endurance and strategy. The outcome, still uncertain, would hinge on whether the Wehrmacht could overcome the relentless challenges of the Caucasus Mountains or whether the Soviet defenders would exploit their home terrain to blunt Germany's ambitions. The stage was set for the climactic struggles that would define the Caucasus campaign, a contest in which victory and disaster hung in precarious balance. Collapse and consequences, the final struggle in the Caucasus. As November 1942 approached, the Caucasus campaign entered its most critical and unforgiving phase. Army Group A, once confident in its rapid southern thrust, now faced the full consequences of overstretched supply lines, the harsh mountain environment, and increasingly organized Soviet resistance. Soldiers trudged through snow-laden passes, engines groaned over icy slopes, and morale strained under the weight of relentless fatigue. The mountains that had initially appeared as a distant prize had transformed into a near impenetrable obstacle, challenging every aspect of German planning and endurance. The German advance toward Grozny and the Baku oilfields had slowed to a perilous crawl. The earlier success of capturing towns and passes had come at a tremendous cost in both manpower and material. Bridges had been destroyed by retreating Soviet forces, roads buried under snow or landslides, and forward positions isolated from reinforcements and resupply. Even specialized mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, found their skills tested to the limit as the harsh terrain and cold weather added layers of difficulty to every maneuver. Tanks and heavy artillery, once the backbone of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, were largely ineffective in the narrow valleys and treacherous slopes of the Caucasus, forcing reliance on infantry and improvised supply methods. Soviet strategy during this period became increasingly proactive. Red Army units launched counterattacks targeting isolated German detachments, while partisan operations disrupted supply lines and communication. In the Tverda and Maruksky passes, Soviet forces executed coordinated strikes against German convoys, ambushing columns and sabotaging vital bridges. These actions amplified the logistical difficulties already caused by mountainous terrain and winter conditions. The Germans, operating deep in enemy territory, were forced to divert troops to guard supply routes and consolidate positions, further slowing their progress toward strategic objectives. What had begun as a rapid offensive now resembled a grueling war of attrition. The impact of winter compounded these difficulties. Snowstorms blocked passes, rivers froze or overflowed, and food and fuel shortages became severe. Soldiers faced frostbite, exhaustion, and the constant threat of ambush. Commanders had to make difficult decisions, press the advance at the risk of exposing units to extreme weather and Soviet counterattacks, or consolidate positions and risk losing momentum. Each choice carried consequences that could resonate across the front. Even the symbolic victories, such as the earlier conquest of high peaks, now seemed insignificant in the face of practical challenges and the unyielding resistance of the Soviet defenders. By mid-November, German units had reached the outskirts of critical northern passes and attempted to push toward the oil-producing regions. However, every step forward encountered fierce Soviet defense, sabotage of infrastructure, and the cumulative strain of months of combat in an unforgiving landscape. The oilfields of Grozny remained largely beyond immediate reach. Even if captured, much of the infrastructure had been destroyed or rendered inoperable by Soviet demolition teams. The strategic prize that had justified the southern offensive was proving elusive, and the costs incurred to reach this point were beginning to outweigh the potential benefits. The broader strategic picture also exerted pressure. The German offensive at Stalingrad, intended to complement the Caucasus Campaign, had stalled, diverting crucial reinforcements, supplies, and air support from Army Group A. Hitler's insistence on simultaneous objectives stretched German command and resources thin, leaving the Caucasus contingent increasingly isolated. Coordination between fronts became nearly impossible, and forward units were left to cope with mountainous conditions and Soviet counterattacks largely on their own. The initial assumption that Germany could simultaneously conquer Stalingrad and seize the Caucasus oilfields was unraveling under the combined weight of geography, weather, and enemy action. The Soviet countermeasures were both strategic and psychological. The Red Army demonstrated that control of local terrain, knowledge of mountain passes, and coordinated defense could offset German technological superiority and numerical strength. Ambushes, fortified positions, and partisan harassment forced the Germans to expend disproportionate effort for each gain, blunting the momentum that had carried them across the plains months earlier. Even well-trained and experienced units faced the sobering reality that the mountains had imposed conditions in which speed, surprise, and mechanized power were severely limited. As the campaign wore into late November, it became increasingly clear that the German offensive in the Caucasus was stalling. Forward units, worn down by months of combat and harsh winter conditions, faced dwindling supplies, exhausted personnel, and the constant threat of encirclement. Soviet counterattacks exploited these vulnerabilities, gradually forcing the Germans into a defensive posture in many key areas. What had begun as a high-stakes gamble to seize vital oil resources was now transitioning into a precarious struggle to hold positions already claimed, with the hope of salvaging strategic advantage slipping further from reach. The failure to capture and utilize the oilfields had profound implications. Germany's war machine, already constrained by limited fuel, faced continuing operational strain on all fronts. The inability to secure Caucasus resources meant that mechanized units elsewhere, including the critical Stalingrad front, could not be sustained at full capacity. Morale, both among troops and in the broader German populace, was impacted by the increasingly visible difficulties in the southern campaign. For the Soviets, successfully denying access to their vital southern resources represented a significant strategic victory and demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of their forces. By December, Army Group A's advance had effectively reached its limit. Harsh winter conditions, logistical impossibility, and persistent Soviet resistance prevented further progress. Some forward elements remained positioned near key passes and towns, but the German army's operational capability in the Caucasus was severely compromised. The combination of environmental, logistical, and tactical challenges had transformed what was intended to be a swift, decisive campaign into a costly struggle whose ultimate objectives remained unachieved. The gamble, once bold and daring, had faltered under the weight of practical realities and determined defense. The Caucasus campaign left a lasting impression on military strategy and operational planning. It highlighted the limits of mechanized warfare in extreme terrain, the critical importance of logistics, and the decisive role of local knowledge in defensive operations. For Germany, the failure to secure oil and resources reinforced the vulnerability of overextended supply lines and the risks inherent in simultaneous offensives across vast distances. For the Soviet Union, The campaign illustrated the effectiveness of coordinated defense, strategic counterattacks, and the use of geography as a force multiplier. The lessons of the Caucasus would resonate not only throughout the remainder of World War II but also in future military thought on mountain and resource-focused campaigns. As 1942 drew to a close, the Caucasus remained largely under Soviet control. The German army had advanced farther into enemy territory than expected but had achieved only limited operational success, unable to secure the critical oilfields that had motivated the offensive. The campaign's final phase had demonstrated the limits of ambition in the face of geography, weather, and determined resistance, underscoring the harsh reality that in war, strategic objectives are inseparably linked to the practical capacity to achieve them. The mountains of the Caucasus, formidable and unyielding, had proven both a battleground and a barrier, shaping the course of operations and leaving an indelible mark on the history of the Eastern Front.